Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is Take the Lead, Change the Game, a podcast for women leaders looking to deepen their knowledge and skills and find enjoyment in the process. We're powered by Safra Leadership. Safra is a cohort-based coaching experience designed to fuel courage and ignite impact among women professionals. I'm Lindsay Goldford Gray, and I'm here with my co-host, Mindy Gulati, and we're the co-founders of Safra. Together, we bring a blend of leadership coaching, strategy, and lived experience to help women navigate challenges, seize opportunities, and lead with confidence. Okay. So when we met last week with our monthly Safra Leadership Breakfast, we had an interesting conversation about transitions. So we wanted to talk with you all about it today. Most transitions are hard because we don't know what to do sometimes, and even more because we really don't know how to think about ourselves as we're sort of in this weird middle space. So they can be exciting times, but also disorienting. Hi, Mindy. How's it going?
Yeah, nice to see you. Yeah, it was a really interesting conversation, and I think it's something that requires us to slow down and notice when we're in a transition. And oftentimes I think we're always doing or planning, at least I am, and that you don't notice that you're actually like transitioning to a new phase. And some of those examples that we can talk about today are the obvious ones, like career changes and becoming a parent. But then there's all these other transitions, moving to a new city or a new location. That's a big transition. Ending relationships. And often as we go throughout life, like sometimes we lose friends and it's not because something bad happened. You transition. There's new priorities. You're in new communities. So ending relationships with friends and potentially family. The kids grow up. Lindsay and I's kids are growing up. And so that's a transition. And then identity changes often are a big transition after there's some sort of big success in your life. And now you've achieved something or you have failed at something. And so there's a transition there. And I find that in this conversation we were having, there was a lot of questioning about wanting more clarity and wanting to know, what should I do? How should I do it? And I found it just a really interesting conversation because it sort of set up this idea of, in a transition, what are we supposed to be doing? Like, how should we be thinking about it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think my tendency is to really just want to like come up with a plan, right? Mm-hmm. It's like
Same.
Step off of point A and I'm like, what's point B? What are the 16 steps that I need to get from point A to point B? Yeah. I'm like, let's start today.
Yeah.
And so the middle space is challenging for me, and also like the identity piece as well. And so that shift is really, really challenging. And I tend to fall into sort of like the clarity trap where I want to like know right away sort of where I'm headed.
Yeah. And I think that most of us, when we're in a transition, so let's say we're leaving a job or our kids are growing up or whatever, we'll say like, what's next? And that's the planning side. That's the certainty. Like, what's next? Where am I going? What's the plan? How am I getting there? And what we're going to talk about today is more encouraging you, instead of saying what's next, to say, who am I now? And I sort of had this experience in that it's probably like a year ago. I think it was like last summer. I sat down and I free wrote like who I am now, because I felt like I had been in this big transition for multiple reasons. But I was in like super planning mode, super type A, like get things done. Everything has to be certain. And I found myself being like, well, who am I? Like, who am I? Like, I'm older. My kids are older. Life is changing. I've moved. And it was like a long sort of odd process to be like, who am I now? And I think it's kind of an interesting way to frame it. Lindsay, what's the hardest part for you when you're going through a transition, and like what's going on in your mind?
Oh man. I mean, it depends on the transition in terms of what's the hardest part. I definitely want the plan. And so sitting in the like unknown and the unpredictable and the like, what do I do next is really, really challenging for me. Mm-hmm. And I think part of that also is because, my transitions tend to be tied to my identity, as most of ours are, where it's like, when I stepped back from Vicina, I was no longer the CEO. I mean, I was still the founder, but like no longer the acting CEO and founder of an organization. And so
Mhm.
what does my day-to-day look like? And who am I if I'm not running this organization? And
Mhm.
then, as my kids have gotten older, a lot of my identity was and honestly is still tied to being their mother. But like if I'm not changing diapers and, like going to elementary school functions, then like what is that about? And who am I? And those kinds of things. I tend to struggle most there in
Mhm.
sort of this like lack of clarity.
Yeah.
What about you?
Yeah. I mean, I think the same. And I think it's part of the framework that we want to talk about today is like the grieving part. And I feel like when I'm in a transition, it's like hard to let go of what like the past and like who I was and like being okay with it. Cause like if you really enjoyed who you were and then you transition naturally, organically, like you're like, so what does that mean? That's where I struggle. Cause like I was like a super intentional, like I was a great trial lawyer. And
Yeah.
then that transition out of that, like just hit me really hard of like, okay, well, who am I now? And like, it was so uncomfortable, but the same for like kids, I was like so invested in them as little children and little toddlers and elementary. And now it's like a different thing of like, well, who am I to teenagers? Like,
Yeah.
and I think I struggle with the grief maybe of like, and it's not grief and like super sadness, but it's more of like letting go that like, well, that's not where I am anymore. Like, that's not who I am anymore. And like that constant changing, I
Yeah.
think is difficult.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Um, what do you feel like is, as you're sort of thinking through that piece, what's the story that you're telling yourself, right? Like, and I ask coaching clients this a lot too, where it's like, what is the, like, play this out for me? If
Mhm.
you're scared to take the leap, let's say, for example, like, what is the worst case scenario? Like,
Mhm.
what story is your brain telling itself as you're in a transition?
Yeah. So I think my default is when I'm in a transition, my default is probably fear of the unknown and like that, like, oh no, like I just figured this part out. How can I possibly have to figure something else out? And so I
Mhm.
think the story I'm telling myself initially, like, and again, this could be like within the same 60-second block is, oh no, like, who am I now? How am I going to talk about this? What does this mean? Like, I'm losing something and I'm scared and nobody else must be feeling like this. I look at my friends and they all got it together.
Yeah.
And so I think initially it's like a negative feeling. And then once I like realize that, I'm pretty good at saying to, the story I'm telling myself is like, oh, well, I get to grow. Like, and I think in our work, like I was talking to a lawyer yesterday and she's like a high powered IP lawyer. And I was like listening to her. She's giving me some feedback about how some of the lessons I've taught her and it's working really well for her. And I was thinking like, oh, I got to take my own advice. I was
Isn't
like,
that
oh, that was brilliant advice
yeah,
that I gave her. And look at her now. And then I was like, wait, like,
yeah,
wait, she's telling me like, it was so weird. It was this like, it was like a multiple layer universe going on because I was like, oh, I shouldn't be so scared. And I should know that like we are changing and it's natural to not be able to do the same things we used to do, but also now we're more wise. And like as lawyers, I feel like we get more wise because the law is hard and it's a technically difficult profession. But it's like you do lose part of that younger swag, but now you're like in this wisdom zone. I don't know if this is making sense, but it was so funny because I was like, wait, like I got to take my own advice here. Like this was brilliant and she did it. And I'm like, now I need to do that. So
yeah, yeah. It's hard to take your own advice. I think we've all been in that situation.
yeah,
Certainly, as coaches, I'm sure you and I have said many things. We're like, oh, I should probably do that myself.
yeah,
But
yeah,
even as friends and loved ones, I feel like that's why it's so important to seek
yeah.
other people's, other people's counsel. Which actually, that point is important in a transition. Is like I do something called the leadership compass in my coaching. And one of the things I do, and it's kind of a strategic vision experience for the client. And one of the things that I do is I don't just interview them and have them do some self-assessment and things like that. I interview like 3 to 5 of their sort of key people. And so thinking about like asking those people, like, what gives this person energy, and where do they, where does stress show up and things like that? Because oftentimes we're not able to see that, right? Because we're in it.
Well, and I like that in terms of like, what story are you telling yourself? Like, you should ask people like, how do you view me in this transition? Or how do you view me like now compared to when you knew me 10 years ago? And it was interesting because a couple years ago, I was having lunch with a friend of mine. He's a CEO of a company here in Austin. And he and I are like same age, same person. Like, I swear he's my long lost twin brother, like same energy, just like go hard, like kick ass. Like, and we were sitting at coffee and we were both like, man, I don't like some of the hustle that we used to do. And like, remember when we were reminiscing, like, remember when we go to these events and you and I would be like working that room and we'd be wheeling and dealing. And then he said to me, he's like, yeah, but we're different now. And he's like, we're different. And I was like, oh, what does that mean? And that got me, again, it was like scary because it was like, oh, am I different? And then he's like, yeah, you're different. And I'm like, well, you are too. Like, you're more mature. You're way more calm. And so we had this whole dialogue. And I think that's why you have to have somebody reflect sometimes on you about what is your narrative, because we grasp onto our old narratives. And there's all these funny jokes about like the people who hang on to their high school identity, right? But I think we all hang on to like parts of our identity from the past that we really loved. And I think it's beautiful to have loved a part of your identity, but it does change, right? And you and I were both trial lawyers. I love that part of my identity. Yeah. I felt like I shed a huge part of myself when I changed careers, and it wasn't all great. It was sad. I was sad about it.
Yeah. For sure.
Yeah. What about for you? Let's talk a little bit about like how you can think about not having that plan. Like, what do you think people should think about instead of having the plan?
Yeah. I mean, I think sometimes, one of the things I've heard one or both of us say, Mindy, in our coaching is like, you can have a plan, but the plan doesn't have to like rest on a decision, right? And so you can develop a plan for rest and time and space and ideation. I think one of the things that we fall into not only is, do we want clarity, but we also fall into like the legitimate busy trap, right? Where it's like, well, if I don't know what's next with this thing, like, what am I going to do with this extra time or whatever it is? And one of the things I feel like I've really learned in the last year is like, if there's not time and space, and the research supports this too, like creativity is really limited. Yeah. And one of the things I'm really driven by in terms of my, professional journey is like being innovative and like, what problem am I going to solve? And I have a little bit or a lot bit of the entrepreneurial spirit. And I got to this point where I was like, I had meetings all day and it was great. Like I was, I've been building the coaching and the coaching has been good. But like, I got to the point where I was coach, like 4 or 5 coaching meetings in a day. And it's like, I had no space for like ideating and rest. And it's really interesting. Like it can actually be like, not only can you get off on a path that maybe isn't the right one if you don't take enough time and care, but also like your ability to think creatively about, I mean, even when you're transitioning into like empty nest stage, like even the ability to think creatively about like, what might I like to do with that extra time is limited and hampered by, our like need to be productive,
Yeah. I think that's really true. And it was interesting because at that breakfast, one of the women who was there was, she's struggling in a transition, like the transition's coming. And I had made this comment to her that like during my sort of inward focus and reflection, I was doing a lot of like meditation and giving myself space just to think. And she said to me, and I don't know, Lindsay, if you were there when she said that, but she was like, well, I don't have the ability to take off a year of work. Because I was saying I meditated for a year. And she's like, I can't take off a year of work. And I was like, no. Like I was working just as much, but I built in space every day to just think. And you're right. Like, had I not built that space in, the creativity, the innovation, I mean, honestly, you and I probably wouldn't be here today because I would have been in my like hard charging, every second of my life has to be busy. And by giving myself that space each day to just have some room to breathe, that's where I was able to figure out what the transition meant for me. So I wasn't planning, because it wasn't planning. It was just feeling how I felt. And I'll say, like, my transition that I went through sort of in that period, this last, say, 18 months, 2 years, was like a move to a new house. So out of a community, my job just felt like my company felt like I needed to do something different. And then I had a teenage transition, meaning my son, who was like my BFF, attached to me like this, you know, loving on me every day, went from like not wanting to be around me. And so that was like a transition that if I didn't give myself space last year to grieve and to feel it, like, and it was not fun. Like I cried a lot. I probably cried more last year than I've cried in my life, but it was that space to just be like, I don't know what is going on, but I got to feel it first so that I can deal with it later. And so it was interesting because that woman I think she thought I like took a year to go to a meditation retreat. And I was like, oh no, like you can do this. You can give yourself this space even when you are busy and when you have a million things on your plate. It's about prioritizing some self-reflection. And I think in transition, you really need that. And I will tell you, I didn't do this when I was younger. When I left the public defender's office, there was no reflection. Like, and I think it really and I think I was just young and wasn't there yet, but I think it hurt me. And I wish I would have had that tool in the transition that I went through. How about you? What about like maybe a transition you went through?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been through several. Like when I left the public defender's office, I also left Colorado, which is where I had gone to law school and lived for a few years. And we moved back to Missouri, which is where my husband and I are both from. And then we had a kid like less than a year later. And so there was a lot there. And I stopped working for a while. So that was like a huge transition. Then we moved to Austin, and, you know, like we all have lots of transitions. I think for me, the most recent one is just stepping down, you know, from Vicina. And honestly, like I'm working now and I've got like a lot going on, but I don't actually feel fully through the transition. Like I don't, you know, and it's been 2 years. But I agree with you, Mindy. You said, you know, I didn't do this when I was younger. Like, I think there's no way that I could have survived in like a little bit of uncertain space for this long in my 20s. Like I just don't.
I agree.
It was like, what is next? You know? And so I think it's been really good. And actually I have a new project that I'm working on that I'm not ready to talk about yet. I know you know about it, Mindy, but it was interesting because it was like, oh, it just like comes when it comes.
Yep.
And all of the things I'm doing are like leading up to that. Right. But it's not like, but that's okay. Like to be kind of just exploring.
Yeah. And I think that's, you know, maybe the piece of advice, what you just said and kind of what we're saying, I think would be something to leave everyone with is like, let yourself explore when you're in a transition. And just be curious. And like, I call it riding the wave of like, sometimes there's panic and then there's grief and then there's excitement. And then there's like, oh my gosh. Yeah. And it's like, sometimes I will literally say to myself in the middle of a day, like, just ride the wave. Like, it's okay. Go slow. And I think that's the way that, you know, a lot of people make it through a transition much healthier is if they just let it take the time it's going to need. And that could be years. That could be years to get through that. Yeah.
You also said something a bit ago, kind of just like offhand and then blew past it, but I want to say it again now. You said, I have to feel it now so I can deal with it later.
Yeah.
And I think that we often tend to do, well, I was going to say, I think we often tend to do the opposite, but actually what I think is we tend to skip one.
I think so.
We tend to like skip the feeling part and just go to like, all right, crisis mode or what, you know what I mean? Like it's go time or whatever the narrative is. But we do have to sit and reflect and feel. So
yeah. Well, hopefully you all like send us your thoughts on transitions. This is like Lindsay and I, when we were getting on today, we're like, we could talk about this for hours because there's so much to it, but hopefully you all got something out of it, and send us a message if you learned something, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah. Awesome. All right.
Bye, everyone. Bye.